August 2nd, 1492. The port of Palos de la Frontera, tucked in southern Andalusia. The sun has already set, and the air drifting off the Tinto River is heavy with salt, silt, and the sharp bite of pitch. Torches flicker along wooden jetties, casting a restless glow over the black water. 3 modest ships sit anchored in the estuary, their masts rocking softly with the current. The groan of wood against rope, the slap of water on hulls, and somewhere back in the shadows of the dock, the quiet murmur of uneasy men. Come morning, close to 90 sailors, officers, and nervous volunteers will climb aboard those vessels and head west into a sea that no European has ever crossed and lived to describe. They have no idea what awaits them. They have no idea if they'll ever set eyes on Spain again. And tonight, on the final patch of solid earth they'll feel beneath them for weeks, maybe even months, some of them can't shake the sense that they've made a grave mistake. If you've come here to drift off to sleep, you've landed in exactly the right spot. That's the whole point of these stories. So settle in, let your breath slow down, and let this tale pull you across the Atlantic at the unhurried rhythm of the 15th century. One swell, one day, one modest wooden vessel at a time. And if you're inclined, feel free to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what hour it is where you are. I genuinely love reading them. Tokyo before sunrise, London past midnight, Sao Paulo on a break from work. All of us tuned into the same tale, split apart by centuries and oceans and time zones, yet somehow gathered here together. So what was it truly like? Not the textbook account, not the legends or the paintings or the statues. What did it actually feel like? In the body and in the mind, moment after moment. To be one of those 90 men, stepping onto a ship, not much longer than a tennis court, and steering it straight at the edge of everything known. What did they eat? Where did they rest? What did the sea sound like, deep in the night, when the wind died and the sails hung limp? What did dread taste like after 3 weeks adrift with no shore in sight? And what crossed their minds when, at last, unbelievably, a faint line broke the western horizon and they understood they weren't going to perish out there after all? Over the time ahead, we're going to find out together. We'll walk across the decks of those small ships, meet the crew, the officers, the young boys, the convicts. We'll feel the pull of the Atlantic swell under our feet, force down hardtack and salted fish, wake to the cry of the helmsman as the watch changes. We'll pass through waters tangled with strange golden weed, watch the mood darken as the crossing stretches on far past what anyone expected, and stand on deck the night a distant glow of firelight flickered over the water and reshaped the world forever. But first, let's begin where they began, on that final night before the unknown, in a small harbor in Andalusia that reeked of fish and tar and fear. Let's talk about the ships themselves, because until you grasp just how small they were, how exposed, how impossibly fragile for what lay ahead of them, you can't truly understand what it meant to cross the Atlantic in 1492. There were 3 of them. The Santa Maria, the lead ship, was a carrack, called a nao by the Spanish, a modest trading vessel, likely somewhere around 100 to 110 tons in weight, with a hull roughly 19 meters long. To put that in perspective, that's about the length of a city bus, or perhaps 4 cars lined up bumper to bumper. The whole vessel, from bow to stern, would fit comfortably within a small 2-bedroom flat, and this was the largest of the 3. The remaining two were caravels, smaller and lighter still. The Niña, likely 50 to 60 tons, with a deck roughly 15 meters in length, close to the size of a 40-foot sailboat you'd spot docked at a harbor nowadays. The Pinta was a touch bigger, perhaps 60 to 70 tons, 17 meters along the deck. Stand at the bow and glance back toward the stern, and you could probably toss a stone and strike the rudder. These weren't ships in the sense we picture them now. They were small wooden platforms, hardly larger than the leisure yachts the wealthy sail around the Mediterranean today. Except these were about to haul 90 men across an unmapped ocean for weeks, with no way to restock, no rescue coming, and no route home except back the way they'd come. Now, we should pause and admit something here. These figures, these measurements, they're informed estimates. The original blueprints for all three vessels vanished long ago, assuming formal ones ever existed at all. What survives are later accounts, comparisons with similar ships, shipwreck remains uncovered from the same era, and a great deal of patient historical piecing together. So when you hear someone claim the Santa Maria measured exactly 108 tons, or precisely 18.9 meters in length, take that with a healthy pinch of doubt. Different historians, different museums, different reconstructions arrive at slightly different numbers. Still, the broader picture holds firm. These ships were startlingly, almost unbelievably tiny. Their layout differed depending on the type. The Santa Maria, being a carrack, carried a raised forecastle at the bow and a taller stern castle toward the stern. 3 masts, with the fore and main rigged in large square sails, the mizzen bearing a triangular lateen sail, and a small square sail fitted to the bowsprit. What resulted was a compact, multi-tiered structure, part cargo carrier, part floating stronghold, with a handful of cramped cabins tucked into the stern castle for the officers, and a tight hold beneath the main deck for supplies, casks, trade goods, extra canvas, coiled rope, and anything else they figured they'd need on the far side of the world. The caravels were built differently. Lower to the water, sleeker, more exposed. Their main deck ran nearly flush, with only small raised sections at bow and stern. During this era, they typically carried a blend of square and lateen sails, a rig the Spanish termed caravela redonda, which gave them greater speed, better handling, and made them ideal for probing unfamiliar coastlines. But that open design came with a price. There was almost nowhere enclosed below deck. Most of the common sailors, the men actually doing the ship's labor, lived, ate, and slept right there on the open main deck, regardless of weather. No cabins, no bunks, no shred of privacy. Just a patch of damp planking and whatever scrap of canvas or wool blanket a man could call his own. Stand on one of these caravels while anchored, and you'd feel the hull shifting beneath your boots, the tide's gentle rise and fall, the creak and groan of timber flexing against rope and iron fittings. Even moored safely in harbor, the ship never fell silent. Beams rubbing against each other, rigging pulling taut then slackening. The scent of fresh tar and oakum, thick and clinging, packed into the seams to hold the sea at bay. The coarse texture of hand-cut planking underfoot, uneven, splintered in spots, still marked by the tools that had shaped it. These ships were living things, organic, flexible, endlessly moving, endlessly noisy, and remarkably small. Now picture packing those tiny wooden worlds with 90 men, 90 human lives. each carrying private fears, private reasons for being aboard, packed together for weeks, with nowhere else to go, and no way out but forward into the unknown, or backward across that same terrifying emptiness they'd only just crossed. They weren't some random gathering of dreamers and outcasts, though later stories like to frame it that way. Most were seasoned, capable sailors, men drawn from the coastal towns clustered near the mouth of the Rio Tinto, Palos, Moguer, Huelva, places where the sea wasn't some far-off notion or thrilling escapade. It was simply the job. These were fishing villages, trading harbors, towns where boys grew up on the water and men made their living hauling nets or steering cargo along the African coastline. They understood wind and tide. They could read the coming weather in the color of dawn. They knew precisely when to reef a sail and when to just ride out a storm. What none of them knew, what no one on earth knew, was whether the ocean sea actually ended somewhere, or whether heading west would simply carry them off the world's edge into some biblical void. Yet they went anyway, largely because of two men who persuaded them it might genuinely succeed: the Pinzon brothers, Martín Alonso and Vicente Yáñez. If Columbus supplied the ambition behind the voyage, the outsider visionary with royal backing and unwavering certainty, the Pinzons supplied the credibility. Martín Alonso already held standing in Palos, a ship owner, a navigator, a man who'd profited from Atlantic ventures and knew how to bring a crew through disaster alive. He captained the Pinta. Vicente Yáñez, younger yet just as skilled, took charge of the Niña. Testimony preserved decades later in legal disputes suggests Martín Alonso personally walked the piers and taverns of Palos, Moguer, and Huelva, recruiting men not through orders but through persuasion. He spoke their language. He was one of their own. And when he vouched that this foreign Genoese scheme might truly reach the Indies, when he staked his own vessels and his own name on it, men took notice. The Pinzon name carried real weight, and it still does, in that stretch of Spain, where streets and squares bear the family name. Their part in making this impossible crossing possible, remembered just as vividly as Columbus's own. The Pinzons brought more than just credibility. They brought specialists. Every vessel needed particular skills covered, certain roles filled, or it wouldn't last a month at sea. There was a carpenter, someone capable of mending split timber, shaping a new spar if one snapped in a storm, keeping the ship structurally sound when the closest shipyard lay weeks or months away. A caulker, whose task was to constantly examine the seams between planks, packing oakum and tar into any gap where seawater tried to force its way through. Because a ship that stops being watertight stops being a ship and turns into a coffin. Pilots, trained in navigation, capable of working a compass, judging latitude with an astrolabe or quadrant, tracking the ship's position through dead reckoning when there were no landmarks, and the stars were the only fixed points available. There was also an interpreter, Luis de Torres, a converso from Moguer, a man of Jewish descent who'd converted to Christianity yet kept a talent for languages. He spoke Hebrew, some Aramaic, Arabic, and naturally Castilian. Columbus had picked him specifically, anticipating encounters with Muslim traders, Jewish merchants, perhaps even envoys of the Great Khan once they reached Asia's eastern shores. Strange to consider now, given what we know, but Columbus truly believed he'd need someone fluent in Arabic or Hebrew upon arrival. Instead, de Torres would be sent inland on Cuba in early November, hunting for palaces and finding villages instead, witnessing locals rolling and smoking dried leaves in a ritual no European had ever laid eyes on. Tobacco, the first documented European encounter with it, all because an interpreter with entirely irrelevant languages was the closest thing they had to a diplomat. There were also men whose presence reminds us this wasn't merely an adventure. It was a business venture, a royal investment. A vidor, an overseer or inspector, sailed with the fleet, charged with keeping records, protecting any gold or valuables uncovered, ensuring the crown received its cut. Notaries, trained to draft legally binding documents. Columbus was an explorer, sure, but he was also expected to return with proof, with accounts that could be verified and taxed. The machinery of empire was already aboard before a single scrap of new land had been claimed. And then there were the rest. The ordinary seamen, able-bodied sailors whose names have mostly vanished from record. Men who trimmed sails, hauled lines, kept watch through the night, scraped away barnacles, pumped bilge water, coiled rope until their palms bled. Young men, some of them, ship's boys, teenagers from struggling families for whom a few months' pay and a slim shot at fortune was worth the terror. They handled the hardest labor, slept in the worst corners, ate last, and had no voice in where the ship went or whether it turned back. A small number of convicts sailed too, men granted reduced sentences if they agreed to join. We don't know precisely how many or what crimes they'd committed, but the fact that the Crown was willing to empty jail cells to fill ships says something about how brutal recruitment must have been. Picture being one of those men, locked away, staring down years in a Spanish prison or worse, and then offered a choice. Rot where you are, or sail off the map's edge with a Genoese dreamer convinced he can reach Asia by heading the wrong direction. Some took that deal, maybe from desperation, maybe because even an unknown ocean seemed kinder than a known cell, maybe because, against everything, they still clung to hope. The sort of hope that keeps you moving when reason insists you stop. And above them all, directing, fixating, calculating, stood Columbus himself. A foreigner, a Genoese sailor in Spanish service, funded by Ferdinand and Isabella, yet commanding Spanish crewmen who didn't fully trust him. He spoke Castilian with a foreign accent. He wore his certainty like a suit of armor, but underneath it, he surely understood how fragile his standing was. He needed the pinzones. He needed the common sailors to follow orders even as fear whispered mutiny. He needed the pilots to trust his calculations even when the distances didn't add up and the promised land never appeared. He was brilliant, tireless, likely insufferable, and he had no idea what he was about to stumble into. None of them did. 90 men scattered across 3 tiny vessels, each hauling their own reasons, their own dread. Seasoned sailors and desperate convicts, local heroes and a foreign commander, boys barely old enough to shave alongside men who should have known better, all of them about to sail beyond the last familiar coastline, into a future none could picture. They departed before sunrise, August 3, 1492. Pre-dawn darkness still clung to the streets of Palos as the men began making their way toward the waterfront. Tradition holds that they first gathered at the Church of San Jorge, the small parish church perched on higher ground overlooking the harbor. Mass, final prayers, the priest's voice bouncing off stone walls as 90 men knelt in shadow, some devout, some simply going through motions, all keenly aware this might be the last time they'd hear those familiar Latin words in a familiar place. Then they made their way down through the old stone archway later called the Puerta de los Novios, the gate of the newlyweds, though that name came afterward, layered with meanings these men couldn't have foreseen. Down through narrow streets where families waited, wives, mothers, children too young to grasp why their fathers were leaving. The quay was packed, torchlight glinting off dark water. The 3 ships already rigged and stocked, hulls groaning against their moorings as the tide began to turn. There must have been tears. There must have been men standing at the rail as the lines were released, looking back at faces some would, in fact, never see again. This wasn't some afternoon fishing trip. This wasn't a coast-hugging trade run to Lisbon or Cadiz. This meant sailing west until they found the Indies or died trying. Everyone on that quay understood the stakes, even without the words for them. Columbus carried royal backing, solid credentials, and the Pinzon brothers lending their weight to the venture. None of it changed the fact that they were heading toward a horizon no European had ever come back from. The ships caught the morning tide, and the river current swept them down the Rio Tinto, past mudflats and marshes, past the final bends where Palos and Moguer vanished behind low hills. By midday, they'd reached open coastal water. By evening, the Spanish shore was just a dark line behind them, and ahead lay the journey's first leg, the only part that felt anything close to safe, the run south toward the Canary Islands. For Andalusian sailors, this was familiar ground, standard practice. Ships headed to West Africa regularly stopped at the Canaries for supplies, repairs, favorable winds. The islands belonged to Spain, outposts of the known world scattered across the eastern Atlantic like stepping stones toward emptiness. Columbus had planned this from the outset. You didn't simply point your bow west from Spain and sail blind into the unknown. You dropped south first. You staged. You waited for the right conditions. You gave your crew one final taste of solid earth before the true crossing began. But even this familiar stretch had its snags. Somewhere off the Andalusian coast, the Pinta ran into trouble with her rudder. According to accounts preserved by Las Casas, drawing on Columbus's lost journal, the rudder had come loose or been damaged, possibly on purpose. Columbus suspected sabotage from the ship's owner, who'd been pressured into lending the vessel and may have wanted an excuse to turn back. Whatever caused it, the Pinta was struggling. They couldn't cross an ocean aboard a ship that couldn't steer properly. So the plan shifted. Reach the Canaries. Fix it there. Then push onward. They arrived at Gran Canaria first, then La Gomera, the westernmost island with a proper harbor. The fleet lingered nearly a month among the Canaries. Longer than Columbus wanted, but unavoidable. The Pinta's rudder was mended, reinforced, made seaworthy once more. More significantly still, they made a major change to the Niña. She'd been rigged with lateen sails, the triangular canvas typical of Mediterranean caravels, ideal for coastal work and tacking into the wind, but poorly suited to long stretches of steady following wind. At La Gomera, they re-rigged her entirely. Down came the lateen yards, replaced with square sails, transatlantic sails, sails built to catch a following wind and hold it for weeks, without constant fiddling. It was a clear signal. This was no longer exploration. This was commitment. Square sails meant they expected to run west for a very long stretch before turning around. It meant Columbus trusted the trade winds to carry them straight across to Asia. It meant the point of no return was drawing near. While carpenters and riggers worked, other men hauled provisions aboard. Casks of fresh water drawn from the wells of La Gomera and stowed below where they'd slosh and leak and turn brackish over the coming weeks. Firewood bundled and lashed down, salted meat, hardtack, wine, cheese, everything they'd need, because once they left these islands, there would be no resupply until they reached land again, wherever and whenever that turned out to be. You can picture the mood. The Canaries were Spanish soil. There were people here, settlements, churches, women speaking Castilian, taverns where a man could get drunk and forget he was about to sail off the edge of every chart ever drawn. Some of the crew must have been tempted to stay, to invent an excuse, an injury, a sudden burst of common sense, but they didn't. Maybe because the Pinzones kept them together. Maybe because they'd already come too far and turning back felt worse than pressing on. Maybe because standing on La Gomera looking west, the ocean didn't seem so different from the ocean they'd already crossed. Still just water, still just wind. The dread was abstract, distant, easy to brush aside when the sun was out and the ships were sound and the wine was good. Then came September 6th, 1492. A Thursday. Columbus gave the order. The last supplies were loaded. The repairs were complete. The winds blew steady from the northeast, precisely what they needed. They raised anchor and pulled away from La Gomera, the island's volcanic peak dark against the morning sky, and turned their bows due west, straight into the ocean sea, into the region medieval maps marked with warnings and monsters and the plain admission that nobody truly knew what waited out there. Later narratives, drawn from Columbus's journal and filtered through Las Casas and other sources, describe the men watching the Canaries shrink behind them with something close to dread. The dark shapes of El Hierro and La Gomera, the last outposts of the known world, growing smaller, dissolving into haze and then vanishing entirely. Just ocean, just horizon stretching in every direction. Blue deepening into something darker, something vast and unfeeling. And the wind, that steady northeastern trade, filling the sails and driving them onward, day after day, without pause. Some sailors reportedly broke down in tears. Some openly believed they'd never see Spain again, that they were sailing toward death, chasing a foreigner's delusion, because pride or desperation had kept them from refusing. The psychological line had been crossed. The last familiar coastline had disappeared behind them. Ahead lay 5 weeks of empty sea and the most improbable discovery in human history. But they had no way of knowing that yet. All they had was the wind, the sails, and the unbroken seam where sky met water. Once the Canaries had vanished, and nothing remained but water, the voyage stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like routine. People can grow accustomed to nearly anything, and the men aboard the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria did what sailors have always done. They shaped a day out of fragments of labor and habit, wrapping themselves in patterns so the sheer scale of what they were doing wouldn't crush them. The pattern began with time, though not with clocks, since none existed aboard, but with sand. Somewhere near the mainmast, lashed where spray couldn't easily knock it loose, hung the half-hour glass, the ampoletta, A simple bulb with sand trickling from one chamber into the other. One of the lowest ranked boys aboard, and every ship had at least one, was handed a duty that never truly stopped. Every 30 minutes, day and night, he flipped that glass. Picture him, barefoot on damp planks, eyes heavy from too little rest, watching as the sand thinned to a final trickle, a few grains clinging, then falling away. He turns the glass, calls out, and somewhere a bell or shouted count marks the moment passing. 1 glass, 2, up to 8 to close a 4-hour watch. Then it starts again. The men's lives were carved up by those turns of sand. 2 watches trading off, one on duty while the other tried to eat, rest, mend clothing, and frayed nerves. 6 watches across every 24 hours, most indistinguishable from the last. Dark, then light, then dark again. Wind from the same direction. The ocean swell rolling beneath the hull in that same slow, indifferent rhythm. Just before dawn, when the horizon is only a slightly paler shade of black, the pattern shifts once more. A boy's voice lifts thin over the creak of timbers and the slap of waves. Maybe it's a simple prayer to the Virgin, or one of those little rhyming chants sailors used to signal a changing watch. Later accounts of seafaring practice suggest something along those lines would have been standard. A sung cue that night is drawing to a close, that the next 4-hour stretch of labor is about to start. Men shift beneath damp cloaks on the open decks of the Niña and Pinta, where most of the ordinary crew spend their entire waking lives during those weeks. No cozy cabins, no private bunks, just whatever patch you'd claimed near a coil of rope or a raised bit of deck that kept you slightly clear of the running water. Limbs are stiff, clothing is salt-hardened, never fully dry. Someone coughs, someone else mumbles a half-remembered scrap of morning prayer. The outgoing watch hands things over. Men who spent the night trimming sails and watching the compass pass their duties to shipmates. The incoming watch checks the lines, fingers running over hemp, feeling for stiffness or hidden rot. They squint up at the pale shape of canvas against the brightening sky, judging how each sail is set. A careful helmsman will exchange a word with whoever's taking his place. The course, the feel of the rudder, anything odd in the swell. None of it gets written down anywhere. It's the quiet, passed-down knowledge of practical seamanship. Then comes the cleaning. However exhausted, however far from shore, decks still need swabbing. Aboard a tiny caravel, filth is more than unpleasant. It's dangerous. Rot, illness, slick planks when the ship suddenly heels. So men grab buckets, dip them over the side, and splash cold Atlantic water across the timbers. Bare feet slap through it. Brushes and bundled rags scrape and scour. The scent of salt and tar, of old fish and stale wine, drifts into the morning air. Ropes get properly coiled. Blocks get inspected. A frayed shroud could mean the gap between a man dying in the rigging and a man climbing down safely through the next squall. Somewhere near the stern, close to the compass, Columbus or one of his pilots is already studying the needle. Navigation, in theory, was the most refined thing happening on those crowded decks. In practice, it amounted to experience mixed with guesswork. Columbus held a confident notion of where Asia ought to lie, distances worked out from books and charts. But tracking his actual position each dawn came down to simple tools. The compass heading, the time marked off by that half-hour glass, and a feel for the ship's speed. There was no standardized log line yet. No tidy system of knots paid out and counted. Instead, they watched the water, foam and weeds sliding past the hull, the rise and fall of the bow. A pilot might guess 3 miles covered in an hour, or 4, perhaps 5 on a strong run. Added up glass by glass, watch by watch, and you get dead reckoning. A faint, hopeful line, traced on a mental chart, in a world where the only land ahead existed purely in theory. As the sun climbed toward its peak, the rhythm paused briefly for another kind of measurement. On clear days, according to later reconstructions of Columbus's methods, he or his pilot would sometimes bring out the quadrant or astrolabe. These weren't precision tools in untrained hands, and the deck of a small ship in the Atlantic offers no steady footing. Even so, there was ritual to it. A few men gathered, shading their eyes. The navigator raises the instrument, tries to catch the sun at its highest point. Shadows sway. The ship rolls. A wave rolls past, and the angle gets read as best it can be. Many of Columbus's recorded latitude readings were badly off, if later historians have read them correctly. But the ritual itself mattered. It marked the day's high point, a moment of focused, almost sacred attention amid endless water. Between these fixed markers, dawn prayer, midday sighting, evening watch change, sat the true weight of the voyage. Labor. Relentless, repetitive, physical labor. Lines needed constant hauling. Aboard the square-rigged Santa Maria and the newly re-rigged Niña, the northeast trades filled the broad canvas, pushing the ship steadily westward. But even in steady wind, sails stretch, chafe, and demand trimming. Men hauled on braces to swing the yards a few degrees. They eased sheets, then hauled them tight again. A voice called out the rhythm. Backs strained, hands burned. Hands. Rope bit deep into calloused palms. Other men scrambled up the ratlines into the rigging, the ship swaying beneath them. No safety harness up there. Just fingers and toes, and a lifetime's familiarity with the sea's movement. From that height, the world opens wide, an endless ring of blue, the faint curve of the earth hinted at by how the horizon falls away. But the man aloft isn't there to admire the view. He's there to loosen or gather a sail, to check for a tear along a seam, to make sure a line isn't sawing itself apart on some rough spar. Down below, near the bilge, another chore grinds on without pause. These hulls weren't watertight by modern standards. Planking shrinks, seams open, waves force their way into every crack. So watch after watch, men take turns at the pumps, working handles up and down, drawing out the cold, sour water, pooling in the ship's lowest reaches, and sending it back over the side. The pump's rhythm becomes part of the ship's own pulse. Creak, splash, sigh, again and again. Between these tasks, anything broken got mended. A frayed rope is unwound, its damaged strands trimmed away, spliced back together. Canvas with a small tear gets stitched before the next storm can shred it beyond use. The carpenter examines the mast's wedges and fittings. The caulker listens for troubling sounds in the hull. There's always something on the verge of failing. The only real question is whether you catch it in time. And when a man's watch finally ended, when he was among the lucky few off duty for a few hours, what came next? Not rest. Not really. The ship is too small for that. Too alive. He might sit with his back against a sun-warmed plank, needle in hand, mending the same shirt for the third time. The fabric is coarse, stiffened with salt. Every stitch has to be forced through. He might whittle a scrap of spare wood into a rough carving, a saint's likeness, a knife handle, anything to occupy hands that aren't hauling rope. Dice show up, little cubes clattering across the deck, fortunes shifting with each throw. An extra bite of something tastier, a swallow of someone else's wine. Stories circulate, tales of other voyages, of Lisbon and Guinea and the Atlantic islands. Rumors, too, about what might lie ahead. Islands heavy with spice trees, or sea monsters, or storms that never let up. Some men sing, the old sea shanties, half prayer, half diversion. Verses made up on the spot, call and response drifting out across the water. Monotony settles in thick as the heat on windless days. The mind keeps circling back to the same question. How much farther, and for how long? As the sun dips and the sky shifts from blue into deepening violet, the pattern tightens again. Evening, the close of another day measured in glasses of sand and estimated miles. The watch changes once more. Orders pass quietly. Sails get trimmed down a little for the night. Fewer men aloft. Closer attention to the compass, to the feel of the helm. Night sailing isn't a wholly different craft, but mistakes feel closer to the surface in the dark. Then the stars emerge. Far from any coastline, with nothing but a few shielded lanterns lit across each small ship, the sky becomes overwhelming. Men accustomed to the dim, smoky glow of houses and taverns watch the Milky Way spread overhead like a bright, cloud-like river. Familiar constellations guide them, Polaris steady to the north always, but scattered around it countless other points of light, nameless, silent. Some officers, Columbus among them, reportedly studied the heavens closely, tracking shifts, trying to connect them to their changing latitude. For most of the crew, the stars mattered less as an instrument, and more as a presence. An immense ceiling stretched over the fragile planks they trusted with their lives. The sounds change at night. Fewer voices. The slap of waves against the hull grows louder without shouted orders drowning it out. The wind in the rigging turns into a steady, low roar. Somewhere up front, a lookout calls out now and then, more out of habit than expectation. There's nothing to spot but water and sky. No lights, no land. Just the small, constant noises of wood and rope and human breath. The boy with the glass is still awake. Sand runs, glass turns, another half hour slips by, another small measure of endurance counted out. Aboard these three little ships in 1492, this is how time passed. Not in days marked on a calendar, not in grand discoveries or crises, but in the slow build-up of ordinary moments. Labor and exhaustion, prayer and boredom, the ceaseless rhythm of the sea, matched by the equally ceaseless rhythm of men adjusting themselves to it, one watch at a time. Amid that pattern of work and watches, there had to be something to hold a man's body together. Rope and canvas, muscle and bone, all of it depended on food. Even if out here, food felt like a generous term. Before any of this, before the endless glasses of sand, there'd been a moment on solid ground, in the small port of Palos, when the voyage's future looked like stacks and barrels and bales. Picture the quay crowded with them. Great casks of water, dark-hooped and sweating in the heat, barrels of coarse red wine, sacks of unmilled wheat and rough flour, piles of biscuit, bizcocho, what later ages would simply call hardtack, slabs of salted pork and beef, packed in crystals of salt so thick they sparkled, bundles of dried, salted cod, baskets of chickpeas and lentils, a bit of rice, jars of olive oil, vinegar, wheels of hard cheese, small sacks of almonds, sticky pots of honey, wrinkled raisins still clinging to their stems. Not exactly a feast, but a promise that for some stretch of weeks, there'd be something to fill a man's stomach. At Palos, they loaded whatever they could, according to the provisioning customs of the time. Historians, working from later inventories and comparable fleets, believe the bulk of rations would have leaned on biscuit and salt meat, softened by legumes and a little oil and wine. Then, at the Canary Islands, the last true pause before the leap into empty ocean, the ships took on more fresh water to top off the casks, more biscuit baked under a hotter sun, perhaps additional dried fish and local produce, anything that could survive weeks at sea. Once the islands slipped below the horizon behind them, that stored abundance began its slow, unavoidable decline. Aboard ship, raw ingredients were only half the story. The other half was what you could actually do with them on a rolling, pitching deck. Spanish vessels of this era carried no cozy galley tucked below with chimneys and iron stoves. They had a box, a simple sand-filled firebox, the fogone, lashed somewhere on the open deck where it was least likely to torch the ship. A spot where, weather permitting, a cook or crewman could coax coals to life and set a couple of heavy pots to boil. Most meals, when the sea cooperated, amounted to some variation on the same thing: a one-pot stew or porridge, salted pork or beef, soaked and boiled long enough to pull some of the brine back out, chickpeas, lentils, or beans, simmered until they burst, a handful of rice, perhaps, to thicken things, a trickle of olive oil, a splash of vinegar, garlic, if any remained, chopped in for bite. Sometimes, instead of meat, it was dried cod, rehydrated and stewed until its fibers gave way. Picture the pot, blackened with use, hanging from an iron hook, steam rising, fragrant more from hunger than any real seasoning. Men lining up with wooden bowls or shared troughs, waiting their turn as the ladle dips and rises. No separate plates, no orderly dining room, just small clusters of men, messes of 3, 4, 5, sitting cross-legged on the planks, backs against the bulwarks or coils of rope, sharing from a common portion. The sea heaves, and the stew sloshes. Someone curses quietly as precious liquid spills. Someone else laughs, because what else can you do? On days when the wind rose and the ship pitched hard, things changed. Fire and open deck don't mix well in a gale. When spray swept the planks and the fogone had to be doused, the men made do with whatever needed no flame. Then the meal might amount to only biscuit and cheese, or biscuit and a strip of dried fish. The biscuit stayed constant, bizcocho, baked and rebaked in shore ovens until nearly all moisture had been driven out. That kept it edible if stored somewhat dry. It also made it hard enough to crack teeth. To eat it, a man might slam it against the rail to break it apart. He might use his knife's handle as a hammer. Often he'd soften it in something. A dip in his day's wine ration, a soak in water, a crumble into hot stew when there was any, letting it swell and lose its harsh edges. Early in the voyage, the biscuit would have simply been tough. As the weeks dragged on, something else moved in. Weevils, tiny beetles whose eggs had waited dormant in the flour and hatched in the warm, faintly damp dark of a cask at sea. Later generations of sailors spoke of maggots and worms riddling their bread, of biscuits that seemed to crawl on their own. There's little reason to think 1492 was any different. Men picked up old tricks, eating in darkness so their eyes couldn't confirm what their tongue already suspected. Crumbling the biscuit into their bowl, pouring stew or wine over it, waiting a beat, then skimming off whatever floated to the top. Protein, if you wanted to look at it philosophically. A test of will, if you didn't. The meat changed too. Salted beef and pork could hold for a long stretch in good casks, but good was relative aboard a small, damp ship. Wood swelled and shrank. Brine leaked out. Fat turned rancid. A cut pulled from the barrel in week 4 bore little resemblance to one from week 1. It emerged gray, tough, reeking of salt, and something creeping toward decay. Soak it, boil it again. You're not chasing flavor, you're chasing edibility. The greasy broth folded into the stew. Men ate what they could stomach, tossed the worst bits overboard, and kept chewing. Water betrayed them too. In theory, every cask left port clean and fresh. In practice, wood is porous, and organisms thrive in water. Under tropical heat, left standing for weeks, what had been clear turned green. A sour film could form on top. The smell alone was enough to turn a stomach already unsteady from motion and monotony. They drank it regardless, when they had no choice. Wine, at least, aged better. It might sour toward vinegar, but it didn't spoil the same way. And there was plenty of it. Spanish military rations from a few decades later suggest roughly a liter of wine per man daily was considered standard. And it wouldn't be surprising if Columbus's provisioning followed similar logic. Wine on these ships wasn't indulgence. It was a staple, a safeguard, often cleaner than the water, a source of calories, and above all, a comfort. Picture the end of a watch. Arms aching, clothes clammy. A man joins his messmates, claims his share from a shared jug or ladle. The wine is coarse, maybe half turned to vinegar by now, but it carries a warmth little else aboard can match. He feels it settle, a thin line of heat cutting through the salt and cold. For a moment, the world shrinks to just that, to the company around him, and the sense that, for this one cup at least, something pleasant remains. Calorically, that rough mix of biscuit, salt meat or fish, legumes, cheese, oil, and wine likely did its job. Later ration scales suggest an ordinary sailor might receive hundreds of grams of bread daily, a solid portion of protein, and that steady wine ration. Enough to fuel hauling lines and climbing rigging, at least for a while. What it failed to provide was freshness. No citrus, no leafy greens, maybe a little onion or garlic, a handful of dried fruit or nuts on special occasions, a smear of honey. But as the weeks from Palos stretched on and the brief abundance of the Canaries faded into memory, everything on the table was either dried, salted, or both. Modern medicine tells us scurvy, the slow breakdown of a body starved of vitamin C, usually needs more than a month or two to fully take hold. Columbus's westward crossing from the Canaries to first landfall lasted roughly 5 weeks. Probably not long enough for gums to rot and teeth to fall out en masse, but fatigue, irritability, small skin changes, these may have crept in quietly, hard to separate from ordinary exhaustion, from too little sleep and the constant nagging ache of labor. And yet, even in its monotony, even amid its slow decay, eating together still mattered. Picture midday on the open deck of the Niña, or the Pinta. Sun high, sails full, the ship rising and settling on the swell. Work pauses just long enough for the stew pot to make its rounds. Men from the same region, the same family, or simply thrown together by chance, gather in small clusters. One dips the ladle, another breaks the biscuit. They pass the bowl hand to hand, each taking a careful, practiced scoop. Talk grows quieter now, mouths too busy for argument. Someone mentions home, bread fresh from an oven, olives off a particular tree, wine that doesn't taste of tar and distance. Someone else, unwilling to dwell on what's missing, steers the talk back toward the sea. The color of the water that morning, the odd way weed drifted past the bow. No one eats alone if it can be helped. There's no privacy, and there's no excess. What one man has, what his companions have, gets shared. If someone saved a few almonds, a cluster of raisins, a spoonful of honey, it might surface now, split among the mess, tiny bursts of sweetness that can linger in memory for days. These shared meals, whether hot stew beside a smoking fogon or cold biscuit gnawed in the dark, did more than fill bellies. They marked the day the way the glass and bell marked the hours. Morning ration, midday meal, evening wine, steady islands of predictability in a world where the horizon never shifted. Even as the biscuits softened with unseen life, even as the water turned and the meat lost all resemblance to anything that once walked on land, these rituals of eating and drinking stitched the crew together. A man might question the course. He might dread the emptiness ahead, but he knew that once the watch ended, there'd be a pot, a bowl, a crust, and the same faces waiting around him. In the middle of an unknown sea, that too counted as a kind of hope. Eating together gave the day its landmarks, but everything in between filled up with something else. A constant immersion, a world wrapped tight around your body that never let go. Had you been there, the first thing you'd likely remember wouldn't be what you saw, but what you heard. Sound came first. Aboard a small wooden ship in the late 15th century, real silence didn't exist. Even when the men fell quiet, the vessel itself kept talking. There was the wind, always the wind. Light, it hummed through the rigging, a low, steady note sliding past rope and spar. Freshened, that hum broke into a chorus. The rattle of blocks, the high whine of taut lines, the occasional sharp crack of a loose rope end snapping against wood. Canvas spoke its own language. In a gentle breeze, the sails bellied and sighed, full and content. In squalls or sudden shifts, they thrashed, loud, violent reports, like whip cracks or distant gunfire, as heavy cloth slammed, filled, and slammed again. Men learned fast to read those sounds, with their ears long before any order was ever shouted. Beneath and around you, the hull never stopped answering the sea. Every time a swell lifted the ship, the timbers flexed, rarely visible, but always audible. A chorus of groans and creaks, joints working, planks rubbing, pegs and tree nails shifting slightly in their holes. New wood, still green from the yard, made one kind of sound. Older, seasoned beams, worn by years of strain, made another, deeper, wearier, as though the ship herself were an aging animal, still strong but conscious of every bone. The sea kept its own rhythm too, the slap and suck of waves along the planking, the hollow thud when a bigger swell landed just right and the bow dropped into a trough. At times, especially in lighter wind, you could hear water sliding past the hull in one continuous murmur, a rushing whisper reminding you, whether you wanted it or not, that only a few centimeters of oak separated your feet from depths no one aboard could truly fathom. Layered over all this were human sounds. The clatter of bare feet or worn shoes on the deck, the thump of rope coiled into place, the scrape of a knife against wood, as someone whittled idly during a brief pause, quiet conversations in Andalusian Spanish, sometimes in dialects thick enough that men from other regions had to learn each other's voices as much as their words. Every 4 hours, the changing of the watch added its own ritual noise. The sand running out of the glass. The bell struck once, twice, up to 8 times as the watch wore on. A boy's voice, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, calling the time or the change, high and clear over the deeper murmur of adult speech. At night, that same voice might sing out a simple chant to stay alert, answered by a drowsy joke from somewhere in the dark. Prayers threaded through all of it, morning and evening. According to later accounts, Columbus gathered the men for communal devotions. Picture the murmur of the Paternoster, and the Ave Maria rising and falling with the swell. Some voices fervent, some automatic, all woven into the sound of ship and sea alike. On certain days, when the weather had held or some danger had passed, they'd add a vow to Our Lady or a favored saint, promising candles or a pilgrimage if only they reached land again. Even when words faded, the ship never did. At 3 in the morning, with most of the crew asleep and the stars sharp overhead, the Santa Maria or the Niña still creaked and sighed and groaned as though in conversation with the ocean. Men who'd spent their lives afloat spoke of listening to their ships, of sensing from a shift in rhythm that something was wrong long before they ever saw it. If sound was the constant companion, smell was the inescapable backdrop. At first, leaving Palos, it might not have seemed so bad. Tar and pitch dominated, the thick resinous odor rising where seams had been freshly caulked, where rigging had been slathered to keep rot at bay. Fresh-cut wood still carried a faint sweetness. Salt air moved cleanly across the deck, carrying the occasional whiff of smoke from the fogon. That didn't last. Damp crept into everything. These ships were small, crowded, and low against the water. Spray blew over the bow, ran down the scuppers, soaked clothes and rope and crates alike. Below, where the cargo sat, barrels of provisions, coils of spare rope, maybe some trade goods. The air turned thick and close. There was the bilge, too, that hidden lowest space where seawater, spilled wine, leaked brine, and every drip and dropping of shipboard life gathered. No one in 1492 had pumps or cleaning routines that would satisfy a modern inspector. Men knew they had to keep the bilge from filling too high. They worked the pumps when ordered, but they also understood that something down there always reeked. A sour, moldy, rotting smell that rose through cracks and hatches, especially in heat and calm, like the breath of the ocean's own stomach. Add to that the smell of bodies. 90 men, give or take, spread across the 3 vessels. Sweat from hard labor under a tropical sun. Clothes that rarely if ever met fresh water. Washing, when it happened, meant seawater hauled up in buckets. Bracing, a little sticky as it dried. Practical only when time allowed. No separate washrooms. No place to undress in private. Men slept in the same clothes they'd worked in. Lice and fleas were likely common passengers. The scent of unwashed wool and linen, of skin and hair and breath, settled into every crevice. Food layered its own notes on top. The smoke from the cooking fire brought comfort. But it clung too. So did the smell of boiling salt meat and fish. Dense, fatty, occasionally edging toward rancid. When a barrel turned bad, when a cut of meat came out questionable and had to be trimmed away, the smell could send a ripple of muttered complaint down the deck. And then there were the animals. Typical practice suggests that, at least early in the voyage, some live livestock may have traveled aboard. A few hens for eggs, maybe a pig or two meant for later slaughter, perhaps even a goat. Each animal brought its own musk, its own waste. Their pens needed mucking out somewhere amid this floating village. Sanitation was simple and exposed. For the ordinary sailor, the toilet amounted to a board or seat rigged over the rail near the bow, forerunner of what English speakers would later call the head. No walls, no door, just a man, his balance, the wind, and the knowledge that anyone passing by could see him. In rough seas, using it took equal parts necessity and faith. Whatever missed the ocean lingered on the hull until the next wave claimed it. Whatever stayed on deck until someone found time to sluice it away added to the constant tang of ammonia and waste. All of it, tar, pitch, bilge, sweat, smoke, animals, latrine, blended into an odor that men who lived aboard ships eventually stopped noticing most of the time. But arriving fresh from land, or stepping away for a moment in your imagination, you might catch it all at once and feel, briefly, as if the whole world were built from salt and rot and life packed too tightly together. Against all this stood touch, the feel of the ship beneath and around you. Motion was the constant rule. Even in calm weather, the Atlantic swell rolled the caravels and the Santa Maria in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The ship rose, paused, and sank, rolled left, returned to center, rolled right, yawed gently as the rudder bit and released. Your feet never quite forgot that the planks beneath them could tilt without warning. Men learned to widen their stance, keep a hand free when possible, move with the ship rather than fight it. Newcomers misjudged a roll, staggered, grabbed for a rope or a friend's arm. Old hands adjusted almost without thinking, bodies remembering what minds no longer needed to. In rougher weather, that motion turned violent. The deck lurched, rising suddenly beneath your boots as a wave lifted the bow, then dropping hard enough to send your stomach floating as the ship slammed into the next trough. Asleep or awake, the sea never let you forget you were a small, fragile thing, perched on a wooden shell. Salt worked its way into the skin. Spray blew across the deck. Fine droplets rode every gust. Clothes stiffened as they dried, crusted with pale crystals that scratched with every movement. Hair tangled and turned briny, lips split. For days on end, everything you touched felt either wet, crusted with salt, or both at once. The ropes were hemp, coarse and fibrous. Hauling on them hour after hour raised blisters on soft hands and thickened calluses on hardened ones. Tar from the rigging worked under fingernails, streaked palms, smeared across woolen sleeves. The rail and mast were smoother where countless hands had gripped them, worn shiny by sweat and pressure, though they could still splinter if grabbed carelessly during a sudden roll. Sleep offered no real escape from any of it. In 1492, European ships hadn't yet adopted hammocks. Those would come later, after Columbus and his men saw the netted cotton beds used by the Caribbean's indigenous people, and sailors realized a body suspended from hooks didn't roll quite so violently with the sea. On this crossing, no such comfort existed. Ordinary seamen slept wherever space allowed. On the open deck when weather permitted, curled against a rope coil, tucked beneath an overhanging boat, or the shadow of the forecastle, wrapped in a coarse blanket that never quite dried. Below, in cramped gaps among cargo and spare gear, on bare planks that echoed every creak of the hull, no tidy rows of bunks, no mattresses. A folded cloak might serve as a pillow. A sea chest, for the lucky few who owned one, could form one wall of a man's whole world, a barrier between him and a messmate's elbow. On calm, clear nights, a man might stretch out beneath the open sky, faint spray drifting across his face, boards hard against his shoulder blades, the ship's roll rocking him like a rough cradle. On wet nights, sleep broke into brief dozes, snatched between gusts and shouted orders. The body always half alert, ready to scramble up if a call sent everyone to the braces. Privacy through all of this was more concept than reality. You changed clothes. On the rare occasion you changed them, in plain view. You relieved yourself where others could see. You dreamed, muttered, sometimes cried out from nightmares within arm's reach of men who had nowhere else to be. A ship this small, 15, 17, 19 meters of deck, felt less like a vessel and more like a crowded, moving room. Every argument was overheard, every confession, every whispered prayer, folded into the creak of the timbers. Over the weeks, the men came to sense something more, that the ship wasn't merely a vehicle, not just wood and rope and canvas, but something like a living partner in the crossing. They wouldn't have phrased it in modern terms, but they listened to her. They talked about her. They cursed her sluggishness when she lagged. They praised her when she rode out a squall more gently than expected. You could read the sea's mood in the voices of the planks. In long, calm swells, the creaks came slow and measured, like a sleeper shifting in bed. In choppy, confused water, they turned jittery, rapid, as if the ship herself grew anxious. When a storm bore down and wind howled through the rigging, it could sound, for a moment deep in the night, like some great creature straining but holding together. Wood swelled and shrank, nails worked loose and were hammered back in, caulking squeezed out and needed renewing. The ship changed under their hands, day by day, just as surely as they changed under hers. So there you have it. Men whose skin tastes of salt, whose clothes reek of smoke and tar, whose ears fill with wind and wood and water, stretched on hard planks that rise and fall like a breathing chest. They eat, labor, pray, and sleep atop a creature that moans and sighs, carrying them west into a stretch of world none of them has ever seen. In that unending sensory present, sound and smell and touch folding endlessly into one another, distance becomes something felt in the bones, rather than seen with the eyes. Land is gone, home lies far behind. What remains is the sea, the ship, and the body you inhabit. And all of it, night after night, day after day, is quietly preparing you for the other world you've been promised, lies somewhere ahead. Faith, for these men, wasn't some extra item packed alongside their clothes. It was the water they'd been swimming in long before they ever saw the Atlantic. Most of the crew were late medieval Andalusian Catholics. They'd grown up in towns where church bells governed the day as reliably as the sun, where processions wound through narrow streets on feast days, candles trembling in the wind, where you crossed yourself without a thought whenever you passed a wayside shrine, or when thunder rolled too close. On land, that rhythm had stone walls and familiar faces around it. At sea, aboard 3 small ships, pushing into what many still called the Mare Tenebroso, the Sea of Darkness, it turned tighter, more urgent. So the day at sea, as later summaries suggest, was stitched together with prayer. At dawn, when the eastern sky just began to pale and the stars over the stern still burned bright, men were called together, bleary, yawning, some crossing themselves as they rose from coils of rope that had served as their beds. The officer of the watch, or Columbus himself aboard the flagship, would lead them through the Paternoster, the Ave Maria, perhaps the Creed. The murmured Latin drifted across the deck, some voices stumbling over words learned by ear more than by meaning. They faced east, toward a sun not yet visible, toward Spain, toward the homes and churches and families left behind. At noon, when the heat baked the planks and the compass held it steady north no matter how far west they sailed, there might come another brief gathering, a reminder that every hour carried them deeper into waters most had never imagined crossing, a chance to ask once more for protection. And in the evening, as the sounds and smells of the previous section settled into their nighttime patterns, there was the Salve Regina. This hymn, Hail, Holy Queen, had been sung on land for centuries, part of the Compline prayers closing out the day. By the 15th century, it had also grown especially dear to sailors, according to later accounts and the general habits of Iberian crews. It seems quite likely that Columbus's men closed each day with it. Picture them gathered as space allowed on the Santa Maria's deck, or in smaller clusters aboard the Niña and the Pinta, the last light flattening across the sea, the ship rolling gently tonight. A voice starts it off, perhaps the ship's boy who calls out the watches high and clear. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae. Others join in, rough and tuneless or unexpectedly sweet. The melody stays simple, built to be remembered, built to carry. The words name Mary as Mother of Mercy, Life, and Sweetness, our hope. They speak of exile, of sighs and tears in this valley of tears, and beg her to turn her merciful eyes toward them. For men who'd watched their coastline sink and vanish, replaced by nothing but water, the idea of exile wasn't abstract. The hymn was devotion. It was also, though none of them would have framed it this way, a kind of shared therapy. Singing together on a small creaking deck, darkness pressing in from every side, turned a scattered crowd of anxious individuals into a single body for a few minutes. Breath synced, words synced. Fear briefly found a shape. It could be carried in through sound, instead of sitting silent in each man's chest. Above all this stood Columbus's own faith, which was anything but ordinary. Most of the crew likely viewed the voyage in practical terms: wages, a royal venture, perhaps some plunder or promotion if things went well. Columbus, by his own later writings, carried something larger and stranger in his head. In his Book of Prophecies, compiled years after this first crossing, but drawing on beliefs he already seems to have held, he wove his life into a tapestry of scripture and end times expectation. The world, as he understood it, was building toward a climax. All lands were destined to fall under Christ. Wealth from new territories might fund one final crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. His westward mission wasn't just a commercial gamble. It was part of a divine schedule. We can't know precisely how much of this he voiced aloud in 1492, but officers close to him, and perhaps some ordinary sailors listening from a respectful distance, would have heard him describe the voyage as guided by providence. He spoke, according to later accounts, of God clearing a path where none had existed, of kings and queens chosen to back that plan, of himself as merely an instrument. For a man shivering under a damp blanket beside the mainmast, that grand language may have felt distant, yet it also served a practical purpose. If the admiral truly believed God had personally ordained this crossing, then perhaps they were less likely to simply vanish into an endless void. Perhaps, when the sea hissed along the hull at midnight and the sky filled with unfamiliar stars, it helped a little to imagine some unseen hand had drawn their course. Because alongside Orthodox faith, the old stories came aboard too. These sailors didn't believe, in any simple sense, that the world was flat like a plate you could tumble off the edge of. Educated pilots knew the earth was round. Their compasses and calculations depended on it. Late medieval cosmology, at least among navigators, accepted a sphere, but knowledge and imagination don't always move in step. In the taverns of Palos, in stories passed from older men to younger ones, the ocean sea to the west had been painted as a realm of shadows, a sea of darkness, a place where winds might die forever, leaving ships becalmed until the men starved and rotted, where great serpents coiled just beneath the surface, where monstrous fish with lantern eyes and mouths full of teeth might rise without warning and swallow a boat whole. Medieval maps sometimes drew such creatures at the edges of known waters, not because cartographers had actually seen them, but because the unknown demanded something to fill it. Some of the younger crew would have grown up on those images. An older helmsman, during a quiet watch, might have spoken of a cousin's ship that sailed too far and was never heard from again, letting the silence after the sentence carry more weight than any detail could. When the bow plunged into a darker patch of water, or a strange fin flashed briefly in the wake, a man's imagination filled in the rest. So you have this blend: priests' Latin and tavern tales, church doctrine and sea law, saints and serpents sharing the same mental ocean. Then, partway across, the water itself began to shift. Around mid-September, according to the summary of Columbus's journal, the fleet sailed into stretches of ocean where the surface seemed thick with floating weed. Sargassum, as we call it now, a branching brown seaweed drifting in vast mats, sheltering tiny crabs, fish, shells. To men who'd never encountered it, it must have felt unsettling. At first, it may have seemed promising. Seaweed meant something had grown somewhere. Maybe it had torn free from a coastline not far off. Men leaning over the bulwarks could rake it in with hooks, feel the slick tangles slide across their hands, catch its faint vegetable rot. They might have tossed out jokes. "We could practically walk ashore on this, eh?" Nervous laughter. But the weed didn't thin. Day after day, by report, it stretched around them, turning the sea into a patchy floating meadow. Winds in that stretch tended to run light. The sails hung less full. The ships crept rather than surged. For men watching the same clumps of weed drift slowly past, the sensation was one of being held in place. Some began to worry. Not about falling off the world, but about never advancing again. Would the hulls snag in this endless net? Did the weed hide shoals lurking just below, ready to tear their planking open far from any coast? Old phrases like cursed waters may have surfaced in whispered talk by the rail. Columbus, whose job included managing fear as much as steering a course, reportedly reassured them. This was simply another sea, another of God's regions, not a trap. The compass still held, the swell still rolled. They remained, he insisted, in the hands of Providence, not of plants. Still, when the wind dropped, and the only motion came from the slow, languid heave of weed and wave, unease crept back in. Men listened harder to creaks in the hull, to slight shifts in the wind, to anything hinting at change. Under such strain, every sign gathered meaning. A sudden streak of light across the sky, a shooting star, might draw murmured crossed foreheads and chests. A warning, a message, a soul, a bank of cloud on the horizon, taller and darker than the rest, could become, in anxious minds, a barrier or a promise. If it resembled land, even faintly, men would point and stare until the last trace dissolved in the shifting light. Most telling of all were birds and the color of the water. When a gull or tern appeared far from known coasts, Columbus and his pilots read it as evidence land lay near. Las Casas's summary of the journal notes their careful tracking of such sightings. Ordinary sailors watched the sky too. They'd grown up near rivers and coastlines where particular birds meant fish, where certain cloud shapes meant rain. Out here, they stretched that habit over everything. A flock winging west at dusk, a single bird circling the mast, then darting off. Every movement was a potential message. The sea itself shifted hue, with depth and plankton and sky. Greenish water, to their minds, might signal shallower seas closer to land. Deep ultramarine suggested bottomless depths. Columbus, the seasoned mariner, read these shifts with a practiced eye. His men, less versed in theory, still felt them. A new color meant a new mood in the ocean. A sign they'd crossed some invisible line. Through all of it, prayer and superstition braided into a single rope. A sudden squall tearing at the sails, and men shouted, hauled, and in the same breath muttered invocations to St. Elmo, to St. Nicholas, to the Virgin. A long calm that stirred fears of dwindling water casks and spoiled food. Someone would propose a vow. If God granted them wind and landfall, they'd walk barefoot to a shrine, or offer up a silver heart, or fund a mass back home. On this first voyage, and even more plainly on later ones, Columbus's crews made vows like these during storms. Las Casas records them. Whether we know the exact wording or not, the pattern is unmistakable. Faith wasn't confined to churches. It lived in calloused hands tracing a cross on a splintered rail, in lips shaping the names of saints as the bow rose and fell, in eyes scanning weed-choked water for a break that might mean they weren't, after all, alone on an endless plain of salt. So these men slept when they could, caught between fear and devotion. On one side, visions of monsters and ships that never returned, of seas without end. On the other, the steady repetition of familiar words, Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, Ave Maria, gratia plena, salve Regina. Somewhere in that space between terror and trust, the days slipped by. Sand fell in the glass. Watches turned. The ships crept west, searching for signs. And as their fear of the unknown rose and fell like the ocean itself, the next stretch of the voyage drew closer. The long middle passage, when tensions would sharpen, and when Columbus, quietly, would begin keeping more than one account of just how far from home they truly were. By the final days of September, the prayers stayed the same, but the space they drifted through had changed. The Canary Islands lay far behind now. La Gomera left on the 6th of the month, and for nearly 4 weeks, no one had glimpsed anything but water and sky. Not the familiar rhythm of coasts and harbors, not islands known by their outline, just the endless, gently shifting circle of the horizon. For most of these Andalusian sailors, that was new territory. They weren't strangers to the sea. Many had run up and down the Iberian coast, or crossed to North Africa, or fished in waters where land was never more than a day or two off. But this was different. Day after day, watch after watch, the shoreline in their minds grew thinner, like a memory worn smooth from being handled too often. You can imagine how the days began to blur together. The same creak of timbers under bare feet, the same smell of tar and damp canvas and salted meat souring a little further, the same low slap of waves against the hull, the same groan of rope through blocks as sails were trimmed. Voices shifted day to day. Today the carpenter cursing quietly at a stubborn plank. Tomorrow 2 boys squabbling over stale bread. But the backdrop never did. It felt like living inside a circle you could never step beyond. The deck, the rail, the mast, the ring of water, the ring of sky. All of it moving, none of it changing. Under that kind of sameness, the mind starts pressing against its own walls. Men began, according to later summaries of Columbus's journal, to count the days in their heads. 1 week, 2, 3. Their rough sense of distance, built from years of coastal sailing, tracked how far a ship normally ran in a day, given the wind and swell, ticking along quietly in the background. Silent arithmetic worked out while coiling a rope or chewing a mouthful of hardtack. And that, Las Casas tells us, is when Columbus started keeping 2 separate reckonings. In the summary he compiled decades later, he notes that on September 9th, the admiral covered 15 leagues that day, but chose to log fewer than he'd actually made, so that if the voyage stretched on, the men wouldn't grow afraid and discouraged. For several days in that record, 2 figures appear side by side. The distance Columbus believed they'd truly sailed, and the smaller number he announced out loud. By the 25th, Las Casas simply states that Columbus consistently let the men believe they'd covered less ground than they had, keeping one tally for himself and another for the crew. Picture that private ritual. Each day, near noon, the pilots aboard each ship worked their dead reckoning, gauging distance covered by the feel of the ship, the set of the sails, the speed of the wake. No log line existed yet, just experience turned into figures. The compass bearing got noted. The sky got scanned for any chance at a latitude reading. Then, once the sand had run through the glass and the sum was tallied, Columbus turned to his chart and journal. Quill in hand, he entered the higher number, the one he trusted, into his own record. The line marking their course, inching west across the vellum, advanced further than the crew ever heard. Then he logged, for others' eyes, the smaller figure, a few leagues quietly trimmed away, a deliberate shrinking of the ocean in their minds. Was this some grand deception, a clever trick pulled over hardened seamen, Modern historians tend to doubt it was quite that simple. The Niña and the Pinta carried their own seasoned pilots, men like Sancho Ruiz and Francisco Martín Pinzón, who could feel the difference between a sluggish day and a brisk one. Ordinary sailors could read the tug of the tiller, the rush of water past the hull. You can't easily convince a man who spent his life at sea that he's crawled when he clearly flew. So the two logs, as we might call them, were likely less about blinding the crew and more about managing mood, softening the official tally, giving anxious men a slightly shorter number to pin their worries on. Maybe two, reassuring Columbus himself, splitting the difference between hope and caution on the page. Either way, the fact that he did this, or at least claimed later that he had, tells us something important. He could sense the tension building. The grumbling didn't begin with shouted threats and drawn knives. It began with questions. According to later retellings drawn from the Lost Journal, someone would mutter near the windlass, "We must have gone far enough to reach Cipango by now." Another would answer, "If there even is a Cipango." Laughter, but with an edge to it. A man lying awake beneath the stars might say to a friend, "When we left La Gomera, did you imagine we'd be this far out and still see nothing?" And the friend might not answer at all. By early October, those murmurs had thickened into something heavier. Las Casas's summary and later chroniclers describe sailors saying they'd never see Spain again, that the admiral's calculations were pure madness, that no one had ever sailed this far into the ocean sea. Some accounts written long after dramatize this into talk of tossing Columbus overboard, of seizing a ship and forcing a turn back. The surviving evidence is gentler. There's no clear record of an organized plot, no roster of ringleaders. What seems most likely is a kind of low-grade, rolling resistance. Men pressing their officers. How much farther? Men approaching the Pinzón brothers, who commanded genuine respect, saying, "You know these waters. Tell him we have to turn back." And here, Martín Alonso Pinzón, captain of the Pinta, becomes more than just a name in the story. Back on land in Palos, Martín Alonso had ranked among the region's leading mariners. His ships, his money, his reputation had helped make the voyage possible at all. Many sailors aboard the caravels were his neighbors, cousins, friends of friends. They'd known him long before they ever met Columbus. So when fear thickened the air like humidity ahead of a storm, men didn't only look toward the Santa Maria's tall stern castle. They also watched the lower, quicker shape of the Pinta, checking whether her sails still held the same course, listening for any hint her captain wanted to turn back. On October 6th, Las Casas's summary reports, it was Martín who suggested altering their heading slightly southwest, following the bird's flight. That small adjustment, practical seamanship reading the signs of life in the sky, also signaled to his men that he still believed in pushing forward. When tension peaked a few days later, some accounts credit Martín and his brother Vicente Yáñez with brokering a compromise. 3 more days, they told the admiral, and the men would accept. If no land appeared by then, they'd insist on turning back. Whether those exact words were spoken, the pattern rings true. Authority across the fleet wasn't a single straight line running down from Columbus. It was more of a web, with the Pinzóns as crucial knots holding it together. Their decision to keep sailing west may have done as much to preserve discipline as any speech delivered from the flagship. Meanwhile, the ocean itself kept playing tricks on everyone's nerves. Cloud banks along the horizon, where warm and cool air collided, could stack and flatten in ways that, from a distance, looked eerily like low, dark land. As the light shifted and the ship rose and fell, those shapes seemed to solidify, then dissolve away. Someone would cry out, "Tierra! Land!" Men rushed to the rail, squinting into the haze. Hearts pounded. Hands gripped the ropes tighter. Then, slowly, the illusion came apart. The shoreline lifted, thinned, merged back into the sky. Only cloud after all. Moments like that, as Las Casas hints more than once, must have left a sour aftertaste. Hope spiking, then collapsing. Laughter following, but shorter each time. Next time, someone might say. And someone else might mutter, there won't be a next time, only more sea. Yet even as false landfalls teased them, genuine signs began accumulating like quiet omens. In late September and early October, Columbus's journal, as summarized, records more and more floating debris, not just shapeless weed, but branches still clinging to green leaves, carried by currents from some unseen shore. A small hand-worked plank. On one day, a stick shaped, they claimed, by a tool, its cuts and notches too precise for any wave to have made. Men hauled these treasures aboard, crowding around them. Fingers traced the smooth edge of the wood, the still supple veins of the leaf. The faint, unmistakable smell of sap brought a different world onto the deck for a moment. Memories of orchards, riverbanks, damp earth. Birds multiplied too. Not just the tireless ocean-roaming birds that ranged far from any coast, but flocks sailors associated with land and islands. On October 7th, Las Casas records enormous flocks flying to the southwest. To Columbus, steeped in old stories of Atlantic islands, this read as clearly as any chart. Birds don't fly all night over open water without somewhere to land, he argued. Wherever they're headed, there must be earth. He pointed them out, dragging men's eyes up from the empty horizon toward the moving specks overhead. See them, he might have said. God doesn't send signs for nothing. Some sailors crossed themselves. Others simply watched, thoughts unspoken. If the birds know, maybe we aren't lost after all. So two currents of feeling ran side by side. On one, fear, whispered bargains to turn back. Angry words muttered in the dark to a friend who listened without answering. On the other, scraps of hope. A carved stick, a fresh leaf, a flight of birds suggesting the world must eventually yield something solid. Columbus's two logs, his shortened public distances and his longer private ones, floated atop those currents, numbers trying to tame emotion, ink lines stretching west, while hearts stretched thin. Night after night, the Salve Regina rose from 3 small ships, lost in a very large sea. Night after night, men lay down on damp planks, balanced on the shifting edge between despair and expectation. And then, as the moon waned and October deepened, those two currents would finally converge. The limits of endurance, and the first sighting of land they'd smelled, guessed at, and feared they might never actually find. By the evening of October 11th, those currents of fear and hope were no longer subtle. They were simply the air everyone breathed. All that day, the signs had kept piling up. Later summaries of Columbus's lost journal note more branches drifting past, one still clinging to berries, small and red against green. Another piece of wood, unmistakably shaped by a tool, a little staff, some said, notched along its length as though someone had carved it absent-mindedly while talking to a friend. Men crowded the rail whenever anything floated near. Hooks went over, lines splashed, hands strained to reach it. When something came aboard, everyone leaned in close. Rough fingers turned the branch over, pressed the leaves, traced the grooves cut into the wood. You can picture how it must have smelled. Sap, soil, a faint clean greenness that had no business belonging to the open sea. For a moment, it cut straight through the usual smells of tar and sweat and old salt meat, like a distant memory of orchards after rain. Birds filled the sky now, not just lone wanderers, but flocks, small birds that didn't sleep on the wing, birds that, in a sailor's private map of the world, meant only one thing: land within reach. Some flew low over the ship, close enough that men could make out the shapes of their wings against the evening sky. Others pressed steadily toward the west-southwest, as if tracing an invisible road. By late afternoon, even the most doubtful men had gone quiet. Whatever they thought of Columbus's theories, whatever they'd muttered about Cipango and the Great Khan, the sea itself now spoke a language they trusted. Leaves, worked wood, birds that had no business being out here unless somewhere offered them a place to rest. So when the sun sank and the sky deepened from gold to ash to blue-black, the mood aboard all three ships felt unlike any other night. Voices, later accounts say, dropped lower. Laughter carried an edge of anticipation. Men on the evening watch moved with a bit more urgency. Those off duty didn't settle into sleep so easily. They invented reasons to stay awake. Mending a scrap of rigging, checking a rope coil, sitting atop a chest with backs against sun-warmed planks and eyes tilted toward the dark horizon. Columbus, sensing the moment, made it official. Las Casas tells us he ordered that no one sleep deeply that night. Extra vigilance on every watch, careful scanning in all directions, and he sweetened the stakes. Beyond the royal pension of 10,000 maravedis promised by Ferdinand and Isabella to whoever first sighted land, he'd add from his own pocket a fine silk doublet. For men used to rough wool and worn linen, that was no small thing. Whoever's name got recorded as first to cry land might find doors opening that had always stayed shut. He might return home not merely a survivor, but a man remembered as first. So the last light drained from the sky above an ocean that, for the first time in weeks, felt less like an endless circle and more like a road leading somewhere. They prayed as always. The Salve Regina rose from the caravel's low decks and the Santa Maria's taller stern, voices carrying across the dark water between them. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. But the words carried a different weight now, not just a plea for rescue, but a kind of advanced gratitude, as though already thanking God for land not yet seen. Wind pressed against the canvas. The ships pushed on. Sometime after full dark, closer to midnight than sunset, a long, low island lay ahead in the night, still invisible to any eye, yet already announcing its presence in the water around it. Waves changed their tone as they rolled over unseen shoals and reefs. The air's scent shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. More earth, more plant, a softness beneath the salt. Aboard the Santa Maria, around what Columbus would later call the 10th hour of the night, roughly 10 o'clock, he claimed to spot something. In the summary Las Casas drew from the Admiral's journal, Columbus reportedly saw a light, but one so faint he couldn't swear it was land. It appeared, he said, like a small wax candle rising and falling, as though someone carried it while walking. It seemed to glow, vanish, glow again. A few men near him agreed they too caught a faint glimmer. Others saw nothing at all. Was it a lantern aboard a Taino fishing canoe? A fire on some distant island, flickering behind palm fronds as people went about their evening, entirely unaware of 3 foreign ships edging closer through the dark? Or was it simply tired eyes, wish and strain conjuring patterns from starlight and wave? Modern historians point out that, given the likely distance to the land they actually reached the next morning, if the light was real, it probably came from a different island entirely. They also note Columbus later used this reported sighting to argue that he, not some ordinary sailor, had technically spotted land first and so deserved the royal reward. Whatever it was, that night it seems to have remained just a curiosity, a note tucked away in the admiral's mind and on his page. The ships didn't heave to. They held their course. Darkness closed back in, and the watches carried on. Hours slipped by, measured by the soft trickle of sand through the glass, by the changing of shifts, by the low murmur of men talking quietly, just to stay alert. Somewhere to the north, the Pinta's bow rose and fell in that same long swell, her hull whispering through the water. On her forward lookout, Rodrigo de Triana, Juan Rodriguez Bermejo of Lepe, stared into the darkness until his eyes ached. It was his duty, and it was his chance. Around 2 in the morning, as the half-moon hung low and the eastern sky had only just begun to consider paling, the horizon finally did something it hadn't managed once in 33 days. It stopped being a perfect curve. There, faint but unmistakable to a trained eye, a darker band cut across the meeting point of sea and sky. It didn't shift with the swell. It didn't thin and swell like cloud. It simply sat there, low, steady, solid. Rodrigo saw it. According to later accounts, he shouted with everything left in his lungs, "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land!" And the word flung across the Pinta's deck landed on the men like a physical blow. They surged toward the rail. Martín Alonso Pinzón, her captain, came running, found a vantage point, and saw it too. The dark line ahead, the pale gleam of what might be surf, where moonlight caught the edge of a reef. He ordered a Lombard fired. The small cannon's report cracked over the quiet sea, its sound rolling out in a slow, heavy echo. Aboard the Santa Maria, men jerked awake, scrambled up, staring forward. On the Niña, heads lifted from damp cloaks, hearts hammered in chests that only the day before had been weighed down with dread of endless water. Land. Relief swept through the fleet like a wave. It's easy to picture shouting and wild celebration, and some later accounts do describe men embracing, laughing, weeping openly. But alongside that burst of joy came something quieter, deeper too. A long breath finally let go. The sense of a knot inside the chest, loosening. Some crossed themselves again and again, words spilling out. Gracias a Dios. Thanks be to God. Others dropped to their knees right where they stood on the planks, kissing the deck that had carried them this far. Men who, hours earlier, had been mentally tallying the long eastward run back to Spain, now stared at the unmoving darkness of land, as though afraid it might dissolve like another cloud. The ships shortened sail to approach carefully through the night. Unknown shallows, unseen reefs. No one wanted to wreck within sight of a shore they'd spent a month hunting for. So they crept closer, feeling their way forward. Through the rest of that night, the dark band of land stayed ahead and slightly to port, no longer imaginary, but still withholding its details. Sailors dozed and woke, rising each time to the same astonishing realization. It was still there. Then, slowly, the sky began to change. Dawn in the Bahamas, though none of them knew that name yet, arrives with a soft unfurling of color. First a hint of gray along the eastern rim, then a wash of pale blue. Then, as the sun draws near, cloud, sea, and land begin separating from one another. What had been merely a darker smudge became, as the light grew stronger, a low green-brown shape, a line of shore. Here and there, the pale thread of a beach. Above it, rising like shadows against the brightening sky, the crowns of trees. According to surviving summaries, the crews burst once more into prayer. The Te Deum, the Gloria, voices hoarse from salt air, cracking with emotion. Columbus dressed in his finest, as did Martín Alonso and Vicente Yáñez. Standards were made ready, the royal banner bearing the emblems of Castile and Aragon, and the green cross flag Columbus favored, marked with the crowned initials of Ferdinand and Isabella. Boats were lowered, hulls thumping gently against the ship's sides as they touched water. Oars were shipped, chosen men climbed down, officers, armed sailors, a notary to witness and record whatever would happen next. The rest of the crew lined the rail, straining to watch. That short pull toward shore must have felt endless. The muted sound of surf at sea thickened now into a steady hush as waves folded and broke. On shore, people were already gathering. The islanders, the Taíno of Guanahani, which Columbus would rename San Salvador, had watched these strange floating towers appear on their horizon with the dawn. Now they watched smaller wooden shapes, filled with pale-skinned men in metal and cloth, sliding nearer. Some, later accounts say, came down to the water's edge, curious rather than immediately afraid. Others hung back among the palms and low brush, half hidden, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The boats grounded. Wet sand met hull. Columbus stepped out, careful in the shallow water, his men following. They carried the standards. On that narrow strip of beach, surf at their backs and the trees just ahead, they planted the royal banner and, in formal words later recorded, claimed the island for Ferdinand and Isabella. They knelt. They kissed the ground. They gave thanks aloud to God, who in their understanding had carried them safely across the ocean sea. Around them stood people whose ancestors had walked those beaches, fished those shallows, tended gardens of cassava and maize and fruit trees for generations beyond any European count. The Taíno watched the ceremony with a blend of amazement and close attention. Columbus would later describe them in Las Casas's summary as well-built, strong, and generous, noting how quickly some brought gifts of parrots, cotton thread, simple ornaments. In the same breath, he mused on how easily, in his view, they might be turned into Christians, into subjects. For the men from Palos and the towns nearby, this morning marked the end of an ordeal. They hadn't fallen off the edge of the world. They hadn't vanished into some nameless void. They stood barefoot on warm sand beneath unfamiliar trees, listening to the murmur of an unknown tongue and the crash of waves on a new shore. In their hearts, relief and wonder, and perhaps a sharp, sudden thought of home. For the people of Guanahani, though they couldn't yet know it, This marked the start of something else entirely. From this calm landing, these wary greetings, these trades of food and trinkets would unfold across years and decades into a chain of events bringing illnesses they had no names for, forced labor under systems they'd never imagined, and the slow, terrible unraveling of ways of life that had once seemed as lasting as the sea itself. But in that first morning light, on that particular beach, those futures stayed hidden. What the sailors felt and what the islanders saw was simply this. After 33 days of nothing but water, 3 weary ships had found land, and 2 peoples were looking at each other for the very first time. From mid-October into the winter of 1492 into 1493, Columbus steered his small fleet west and south, island to island, convinced he was skimming along the outer edges of Asia. By his own letters and the later summary of his journal, he believed these were the Indies he'd promised the crown, perhaps the fringes of Cipango, perhaps some province of the Great Khan. To the men on deck, it felt less like geography and more like waking into different dreams of abundance. Every few days brought a new shore, long, low quays fringed with sand as white as crushed shell, larger islands rising blue-green out of the horizon, hills softened by haze. They dropped anchor in lagoons so clear that anchors, cables, even schools of fish showed plainly far below. The air's scent shifted place to place, sometimes floral, sometimes sharper, with dense wet forest. The ships would lie to, straining gently against their cables, and boats would head ashore. You might be among the armed party chosen to escort the admiral, or you might stay aboard, your world narrowed back to rigging, watch, and a glimpse of land too far to swim to. Either way, the pattern repeated. New beaches underfoot, new paths pushing into shade, where sunlight fell in mottled patches through leaves you couldn't name. Fruit cut open and handed to you, sweet in ways your tongue had never known. Some islands held only a scattering of houses, canoes overturned on sand, people who watched from a distance and then slipped away. Others held whole villages, houses of wood and thatch, fields of cassava and maize, paths worn smooth by countless bare feet. Columbus would later praise in his letter how marvelously fertile the lands were, how many streams and groves and harbors he'd found. To him, every inlet was a potential port on Asia's edge. To you, they were simply strange and vivid places that rose out of the sea, then slipped away again as sails climbed and anchors came aboard. What lodged more firmly in memory were the people. The Taino and related islanders met in those weeks, came down to the beaches with open hands. Surviving descriptions say they approached out of curiosity, not with weapons raised. Men and women, some painted, some adorned with small flecks of gold leaf or hammered discs, some with parrots perched on their shoulders, stood in the shallows, watching the boats draw closer. Gifts crossed that thin line where sea met sand. From the ships, glass beads, tiny and bright, strung on cord, little brass bells that chimed when shaken, red wool caps, their color as vivid as blood in sunlight. From shore, balls of fine, carefully spun cotton thread, parrots in riots of green and red and yellow, claws gripping forearms and shoulders, baskets of cassava bread, roots, fruit, and now and then a small ornament of yellow metal, a nosepiece, a sliver of leaf hammered thin, a ring. To the sailors, These exchanges felt astonishing. Oddly playful, too. Beads that had lined chests back in Palos, bells that once seemed like meaningless trinkets, suddenly became tokens of real value. Men watched, amazed, as islanders' faces lit up at the flash of colored glass or the jingle of metal. They laughed at parrots' rough attempts to mimic Spanish words, marveling at the birds' colors as much as the islanders marveled at the glint of steel blades. To Columbus, the same scenes carried different meaning. In pages preserved by Las Casas, he remarked again and again on the people's generosity, how they'd give whatever they had for whatever was offered in return, seeming to lack any guile. Yet in the same breath, he wrote that they'd make good servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. He probed gently, through gestures and borrowed interpreters, always circling the same questions. Where did the gold come from? Did they know of a great king? Was there a city somewhere inland? Islanders often gestured vaguely toward the horizon or distant hills, naming far-off places: Banacan, Babeque, Cibao. To them, these words meant regions and chiefdoms within their own world. To Columbus, the sounds echoed names he'd read in Marco Polo. They seemed like proof that Asia lay just out of sight. When the fleet reached the great long island now called Cuba at the end of October, that impression of scale and promise only deepened. The coastline stretched on and on. Rivers poured out of the interior. Tobacco smoke curled from village doorways. Columbus sent men inland, by his own letters, and they returned with tales of broad paths, cultivated fields, and more people, all treating them with food and hospitality. He convinced himself, at least in his written reports, that he might be nearing the mainland of Cathay. Then, early in December, came Hispaniola. From the sea, Hispaniola's northern coast must have looked especially grand. Highlands rising inland, river mouths opening into green interior, wide bays offering good holding ground for the caravels. Taino canoes came out toward the anchored ships, narrow and nimble on the water, some large enough to carry dozens. Gold finally appeared, not just as an occasional trinket, but in stream beds and in ornaments worn by local leaders. Columbus heard the name Cibao for the mountainous inland region and seized on it as something close to Chipango, imagining the fabled islands of eastern Asia had at last come within reach. For the sailors, Hispaniola meant long days rowing to and from shore, cutting and hauling wood, standing armed watch, while trade and talk unfolded around them in a language they didn't understand. But it also meant streams of sweet water for bathing, fresh fruit in abundance, and, after leaving Spain, the feeling that they'd perhaps reached somewhere that actually mattered to the powerful people whose favor shaped their lives. Then, on a quiet, starlit night close to Christmas, the sea reminded them how fast it could upend everything. It was the night of December 24th. According to later reconstructions from the Lost Journal, the Santa Maria ran along Hispaniola's north coast, close enough that in the pauses between creaks and murmurs aboard, you could hear the distant thud of surf against reefs. The wind was gentle, the air soft. Columbus, often sleepless, chose this night to rest. He handed the helm to a steersman who, Las Casas reports, passed the tiller in turn to an inexperienced ship's boy, something sound seamanship strictly forbade. Slowly, too slowly for anyone dozing on deck to notice at first, the flagship drifted off her safe course. The water beneath her keel grew shallower, Somewhere below, pale coral rose toward the surface, unseen. Then, with a sudden shudder that would have torn sleep from any man, the Santa Maria struck. The sound must have been unlike anything they'd heard before. A deep grinding, a crack of timber, the clatter of loose gear knocked from its place. The hull lurched, wedged fast against the coral. Men tumbled, grabbing at stays and rails. Shouts split the night, calls to the pumps, orders to lighten the ship, cries to cut the anchor free. They worked furiously in the dark, but the sea worked more steadily still. With every swell, the ship's heavy stern rose and fell, driving her bow deeper onto the reef. Water pushed in through open seams. Soon it was clear. She wasn't coming free. Word traveled up the coast. Taino from the nearby settlement of the Cacique Guacanagari came out in canoes at first light. By Columbus's own account, they helped without hesitation, ferrying cargo, spars, provisions, even planks ashore. Bales of cloth, barrels of wine, iron tools, personal chests, all passed hand to hand from the doomed carrack to the sand. It was, in a sense, the most intimate mingling yet of the two worlds. An entire European ship's contents emptied into an islander's bay under their careful assistance. With the Santa Maria beyond saving, and only the Niña and Pinta still seaworthy, Columbus faced a choice. He couldn't cram all his men onto the two smaller caravels for the return voyage, not without inviting disaster. And he wouldn't abandon the foothold he believed he'd secured in these new lands. So he did something later historians mark as the start of a very different story. He decided to build a fortress from the splintered ribs and planks of the Santa Maria, from local timber cut by European axes and carried on Taino shoulders. A small stockade rose near the shore. A handful of houses, a storehouse, a rough palisade of timber stakes. He named it La Navidad, in memory of Christ's birth and the night his flagship died. For the men assigned to remain there, roughly 39 by Columbus's own letter, it must have felt like stepping off the edge in an entirely new way. They were soldiers and sailors accustomed to a ship's constant motion, now told that this strip of foreign earth, under the protection of a cacique whose language they barely understood, would be their home. They had provisions, salvaged gear, weapons, and the admiral's promise that he'd return with more men and supplies. They also had rumors of gold inland and the freedom that came with escaping shipboard discipline. Some, standing inside the new palisade looking out at the sea, likely tasted opportunity. No cramped bunks, no heaving deck, solid ground underfoot, access to the riches of an island that seemed abundant beyond measure. Others, more wary, may have watched the Niña and Pinta ride at anchor with a tightening in the chest, understanding that whatever unfolded on Hispaniola in the months ahead, they'd face it with no easy road back to Spain. Aboard the ships, the mood ran differently. Men chosen to sail home packed what little they owned. Some new trinkets, perhaps a parrot or two, memories already forming into stories, and eyed the winter sky uneasily. The Atlantic in January could turn savage. They'd crossed it once with 3 vessels and full holds. Now they'd return with only 2 small caravels, more mouths aboard, and in their ballast a cargo of symbols, scraps of gold, strange plants, a few captured parrots, and living people. By this point, Columbus had already begun seizing Taino individuals to bring back as proof. Somewhere between a dozen and 24, by various accounts, were placed aboard as captives. In his mind and in his letters, they served as evidence of his discovery, souls for baptism, potential interpreters, potential laborers. To themselves, torn from family and home shores, they were simply prisoners aboard wooden islands, about to head out into a merciless sea. That sight, the palisade of La Navidad shrinking behind you on the shore, your comrades growing smaller among the houses and timbers, Taino canoes hovering nearby, and on your own crowded deck, the faces of islanders who'd never chosen this voyage, offered an early glimpse of what this discovery would ultimately cost. But that day, as sails rose and the caravels turned their bows back toward the rising sun, most of the men thought in simpler, narrower terms. The garrison watched the ship's masts shrink on the horizon, feeling solid ground steady beneath their feet, and the weight of an unknown future gathering like clouds over the green hills. Those at sea felt the old familiar roll return, the song of rigging and hull, and the long pull toward home ahead. Between them, in the small fort named for Christmas, stood the wreck's timbers, wood that had crossed an ocean and in breaking apart had rooted Europe's presence on the Caribbean shore. They didn't linger long. Within days of the wreck and the raising of La Navidad's palisade, Columbus ordered the 2 remaining ships made ready. Holds were rearranged, ballast shifted, spars and rigging checked and rechecked. Men went ashore one final time to fill casks at freshwater streams, cut a few more timbers, offer whatever awkward farewells felt right. Sometime around mid-January 1493, the Niña and the Pinta raised their anchors. The Santa Maria lay broken on the reef not far off, her ribs now part fortress, part memory. The fort's 39 men stood on the beach, or along the rough timber wall, watching the caravels gather way, winter light catching the wet sheen of their hulls. Taino canoes hovered beyond the surf, paddles rising and falling in that same steady rhythm as always, even as the foreign ships turned outward. On deck, you'd have felt the familiar jerk and lean as sails caught the wind. Lines hummed. Pilots' voices carried across the water, calling courses that sounded different from the simple westward push of the previous summer. This time they weren't sailing blindly into rumor. This time they aimed for home. The route, though, didn't point straight east. By Columbus's own later account, and by what pilots of the era knew from Portuguese practice, getting home from these latitudes required something less obvious. First north. Only once you'd climb to the right band of sky would you turn northeast and east, letting the great winds carry you onward. So in those early days, as Hispaniola's blue hills sank below the horizon, the caravels angled up the ocean, tracing a course that to a sailor who knew only Andalusia's coastal waters might have seemed a strange wandering. You couldn't see the wind systems on any chart, but you could feel them. The warm trades that had pushed you west began to slacken. The sea's texture changed, swells arriving from a slightly different quarter. High clouds wrote different, colder stories across the sky. Aboard the Niña, now Columbus's flagship, the deck was more crowded than ever. Men from the Santa Maria had come aboard. Provisions, salvaged gear, and the voyage's living evidence, the parrots, the cotton, the scraps of gold, and the Taino captives filled every narrow space between mast and rail. At night, once your watch ended, there was barely room to stretch out. You might find a spot beneath an overturned boat on deck, or curl against a rope coil smelling of tar and salt. The sea's pulse beneath the hull stayed steady, but colder now than on the westward crossing. The air cut sharper through wet wool and linen. Overhead, the stars swung slowly through their northern arc. Every so often an officer would come up with an astrolabe or quadrant, sighting along its edge to fix your latitude against the sky. For a few weeks, the homeward voyage went more smoothly than many might have feared. Days brought fair following winds, the ships running free with square sails bellied out, corkscrewing along the wide Atlantic swells. The men sang work songs in cracked voices, played rough games of chance with knuckle bones or carved wooden tokens, and talked endlessly about who'd arrive first at Palos, what reward the crown might grant, which tales they'd polish up for taverns and family hearths. But winter at sea between continents carries its own temperament. Somewhere near the Azores latitude in mid-February, the sky turned. By the later summary of Columbus's journal, the first warning came as a ring around the moon, pale and haloed. Then, over several days, the wind freshened, swung, and refused to settle. Low pressure you couldn't name pressed down in your bones. The sea grew restless, shorter crested, chopped by crossing swells. Sails were shortened, then shortened again. Lines once soft, with use turned hard in your hands. The storm that finally broke over the Niña and Pinta didn't arrive as a sudden squall, but as a vast, mounting chaos. The wind rose and kept rising, tearing the voice out of speech, turning every shout into shredded sound. The caravels, small and tough as they were, began to labor. Every time the bow climbed a wave, there came that sickening pause before the plunge. Green water smashing along the rail, unsecured gear crashing as it slid and struck. On deck, you'd have been soaked within minutes, cold driving through every seam. The world shrank down to the width of the deck, and the white roar surrounding you. Men moved bent double, clinging to stays and shrouds, eyes narrowed against the horizontal spray. Orders from the quarterdeck arrived as much through gesture as through words. Haul, slack, lash. Somewhere in that chaos, in the howling dark of a February night, the Pinta vanished. One moment her lights would have offered a faint, bobbing comfort off your quarter. The next they were gone, swallowed by waves and rain. You can picture the shouts on both ships, frantic attempts to signal, to hold formation, but the sea doesn't care for human arrangements. The Niña and the Pinta were torn apart by moving walls of water and driven onto separate paths across the Atlantic. Aboard the Niña, the realization sank in slowly. If one ship went down now, no other eyes would ever witness it. The ocean that had carried you to lands no one in Europe had ever described might now close over you without a trace. No bodies washed ashore, no broken mast on a familiar beach, just absence. It's in this setting that later writers place the scene of the vows. Las Casas, drawing on Columbus's lost log, describes the men gathering as best they could on that pitching deck, casting lots to assign pilgrimages and offerings they'd make if they survived. One vow was to walk barefoot and in shirts in solemn procession to the first shrine of Our Lady they reached on Spanish soil. Another was to fast on bread and water. Another was to keep vigil at Santa Clara in Moguer. Another was to visit Our Lady of Guadalupe or of Loreto. Names of saints and holy places passed mouth to mouth. Half prayer, half bargain. In the middle of the storm's blind fury, men clung not only to rigging, but to these imagined futures where they'd survived long enough to keep their promises. Columbus himself, despite his usual confidence, appears in surviving reports as deeply shaken. At the height of one of these tempests, with waves so towering they seemed, in his own later words, to bury the ship in valleys of water, he's said to have done something quietly desperate. By that tradition, he sat in the cramped shelter of the cabin, on a deck that refused to stop moving, and wrote in hurried script an account of the islands he'd found, the route he'd taken, the lands and peoples now described for the first time in European ink. He addressed it to the Catholic monarchs, folded the parchment, wrapped it in oilcloth or waxed linen to keep out the sea, and sealed the bundle inside a small wooden cask. Then, with a final prayer, he had the cask carried up and heaved over the side into the raging water. It's hard to know how literally to take this story. The journal is gone. The cask, if it ever existed, was lost to the currents. But the image has clung to the voyage's memory, a single container bobbing between mountains of water, carrying words that might outlast the men who wrote them. A kind of message in a bottle sent from the edge of one world toward the heart of another. In the end, the Niña never needed that final courier. Battered, spars groaning, some sails reduced to ragged patches, she rode out the blows. Days later, as the wind finally eased and blue began showing through shredded cloud, land appeared, low and uncertain at first, then firmer. The Azores, anchoring there among those familiar Portuguese islands, must have felt like slipping briefly into a calmer reality. The sea settled in the shelter of the land. The constant motion softened. Men could hear their own voices again without shouting. By some accounts, part of the crew went ashore to fulfill the first of their vows, processing barefoot to a small church. Local officials, wary or simply following orders from Lisbon, held a number of them for questioning. For a few tense days, the Niña sat nearly empty of hands, riding lightly at anchor, while her scattered crew argued their case ashore. Eventually, most were released and brought back aboard. Columbus, unwilling to linger in uncertainty, ordered the anchors raised once more. The parade of waves resumed, this time carrying the Niña northeast toward Europe's coast. Another storm blew them east faster than intended. The ship, driven before the wind, missed the safer approach to Castile and instead found herself, early in March, off the mouth of the Tagus River, Portugal's own watery road to its capital. Columbus, without much choice, took shelter there and requested permission to sail up to Lisbon. In that gray river light, with low shores sliding past and other ships riding at anchor, Portuguese caravels, rounder and broader than the Niña, you'd have felt a strange blend of foreignness and familiarity. The smell of tar, the creak of timbers, the cries of gulls matched what you knew from Palos, but the flags, the languages carried across nearby decks, the churches perched on the hills, none of it belonged to you. By multiple accounts, Columbus was summoned to speak with King John II. The conversation itself has been shaded by later retellings. The Portuguese king questioning, perhaps skeptical, perhaps irritated, that a Genoese sailing for Castile had crossed waters his own captains had long known. Columbus, for his part, insisting he'd found islands to the west, rich lands he believed sat on Asia's edge. For you, an ordinary sailor, this royal audience would have reached the deck only as rumor, fragments passed along, one more story to turn over while you scrubbed salt from rope and patched worn canvas. From Lisbon, once wind and politics allowed, the Niña sailed south and west, along the familiar Iberian coast. The weather in those final days eased. Swells lengthened, grew more regular. The sea's color shifted toward the green-brown you knew from home waters. Coastal birds began appearing. Gannets, gulls, perhaps the odd cormorant with its particular cry. The smell of land rode the breeze in faint traces. Earth, distant wood smoke, the resin of pine. Meanwhile, the Pinta, having survived the storms on her own separate course, had already reached Spain. She slipped into Bayona in Galicia, spreading the news there first, before turning south toward Andalusia. Her captain, Martín Alonso Pinzón, so crucial to the voyage, leading, persuading, sometimes clashing with Columbus's decisions, was by then gravely ill, worn down by fever and strain. On the morning of March 15, 1493, roughly 7 months after 3 ships had slipped past the bar of Saltes, 2 small caravels came home. Picture that harbor at Palos, the same low shores, the same monastery of La Rábida watching from its ridge, the same familiar silhouettes of fishing boats and small traders at anchor. But now, church bells rang out in patterns of celebration. People lined the banks and packed the quays. Sailors' families, townsfolk, monks, curious onlookers from nearby villages who'd come to see whether the rumors held true. The Niña and Pinta, salt-streaked, patched and worn, glided in on the tide. Their flags, by some accounts, carried strange devices, perhaps a banner announcing the islands of the Indies. The men on deck looked thinner, sun-darkened, but undeniably present, faces picked out against the sails. From shore, wives and children and parents scanned the decks for single figures. From the ships, men leaned over the rails, searching for familiar faces ashore. The mood, if contemporary letters can be trusted, verged on astonishment. Not only had the expedition returned when many had quietly assumed it would vanish, but it brought word of lands no one in Palos had ever pictured so vividly. Islands blanketed in forest that stayed green year-round, rivers untouched by frost, people who wore gold as ornament and painted their skin in colors no one here had names for. The sailors stepped ashore into that warm, chaotic welcome. Some walked barefoot in fulfillment of their storm vows, processing to nearby shrines. Others simply embraced whoever reached them first and staggered, still half readjusting to solid ground, toward the nearest tavern, the nearest table, the nearest bed that didn't move. Within days, Columbus himself would be riding inland bearing letters to the royal court, already shaping his discovery into the story that would echo across Europe. Most of the men who'd shared those cramped decks and long watches never followed him into that wider history. They slipped back into their old trades, fishing, coastal shipping, small ventures to Cadiz, or down the African coast. They quietly carried memories of parrots' cries in the rigging, of warm island rain, of the strange soft feel of Caribbean sand beneath bare feet. Around hearths and along wharves, they shared fragments of these memories in the years that followed, stories that blurred and shifted as sleep and time smoothed their edges. Not everyone who made the great outward crossing lived long into this new, celebrated peace. Martín Alonso Pinzón, according to chroniclers, reached Palos almost alongside Columbus, coming up the river in a weakened state. He's said to have gone to La Rábida, the monastery that had sheltered the expedition's early planning, and there, worn down by fever, Perhaps from infections picked up during the voyage, perhaps from the sheer weight of stress and labor, he died within days. Later writers speculated about causes, whispering of diseases carried back from the islands, but certainty stays elusive. What's clear is that the man who had commanded the swift Pinta, who had helped hold the crews together when fear ran high mid-ocean, never lived to see how far this voyage's ripples would spread. And far off, across that same ocean, on Hispaniola's north coast, the small fort of La Navidad stood with walls of ship timber and local wood. Inside it, 39 Europeans were beginning their own strange, precarious existence among the Taino chiefdoms, trading, arguing, exploring, making choices that would never be recorded in detail. Columbus had left them with promises he'd return quickly, with more men, more supplies, more tools. He did return less than a year later, leading a much larger fleet. When he came back to that bay in late November 1493, surf still broke on the reef where the Santa Maria had torn herself open. Palms still swayed in the trade wind, and the river still emptied its fresh water into the sea. But La Navidad was no longer a living outpost. The palisade lay burned. The houses were gone. The garrison, every one of the 39, was dead. Later reconstructions drawn from Columbus's letters and other testimonies suggest quarrels among the men, rivalries over gold and women, raids on neighboring villages, and eventually a decisive response from Taino forces. The first permanent European foothold in the Caribbean had lasted only months. For the sailors who'd come home aboard the Niña and Pinta, this news, once it reached them, must have added a dark, unsettling layer to their memories. The voyage they'd made, with its nights of stars and storms, its first glimpse of strange shores, had already turned to legend in the taverns of Palos. But the story didn't end with their return, nor with the cheers on the quay. It continued out of sight, in places where the Atlantic swell still rolled toward foreign sand. You, listening now, can feel the arc of that first crossing and return. The departure, the long westward push, the island harbors, the wreck and the hurried fortress, the winter storms and desperate vows, the landfall in Europe, and the homecoming into a harbor both the same and no longer the same. A loop closed, but also opened, because what those small caravels had done was stitch two worlds together with a seam of wind and water that could never again be fully undone. You've traced that seam now in imagination, if not in body. You've stood on the crowded deck of a caravel where men truly slept in the open, wrapped in cloaks that never quite dried. You've felt, at least in your mind's hands, the rough grain of wet rope, heard the low mutter of prayers and curses, the slap of loose canvas in a slackening wind. You followed them from Palos to the Canary Islands, watched the familiar coastline fall away, then lived, measured, day after measured day, with nothing but water on every horizon. You've watched the mood aboard shift again and again, confidence to unease, unease to open fear, then to the taut, brittle patience of men who've decided they'll see it through, because there's no other direction left to go. You've smelled the sour casks and the salt meat, the ever-present tar and sweat, felt the ship's small wooden world roll beneath your feet until even solid ground seemed, for a moment, to sway. And you've stepped off with them, onto those Caribbean beaches, under trees none of them had words for, before people whose lives had followed their own rich, complicated paths, long before any European name was ever spoken across that sea. For the sailors, this was discovery and wonder. For the Taino communities who met them, it marked the first sign of a tide that would, across generations to come, bring war, forced labor, and the invisible armies of old-world disease. By later estimates, whole chiefdoms across the Caribbean would be reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. One voyage, a few dozen men aboard 3 small ships, became the opening page of what historians now call the Columbian Exchange. 2 worlds, suddenly and violently linked. Both truths sit together in the wake of 1492. There was real courage in sailing west into waters your charts didn't truly know, in crossing an ocean aboard vessels barely longer than a modern bus, guided by dead reckoning, simple instruments, and steady trust in wind and current. There was also real harm in what that courage enabled: systems of tribute, conquest, and dispossession, whose consequences indigenous people still remember and resist today. The same swell that lifted those caravels also carried their shadows. As you lie here now, wherever you are, you've made that crossing alongside them and returned. If you're still awake at this point, feel free to stay in this quiet a little longer. If you drifted off somewhere mid-Atlantic, you've simply done what many of those sailors must have wished for during long night watches: slipped gently out of the wind and into sleep. If you'd like to support more journeys like this one, there are simple ways to help. You can tap like or subscribe so the next voyage finds its way back to you. You're welcome to leave a comment too, letting us know where in the world you're listening from, and whether you reached landfall awake or drifted off somewhere between Palos and the Indies. There's also an option to join the channel as a member for those who want to support this work more directly. But that stays entirely optional. Your presence here, your time and attention are already enough. So let the story settle now. Picture the harbor of Palos once more, but emptied of crowds, the shouting faded, the taverns quiet, the Niña and the Pinta lying at anchor on a still night, their hulls no longer straining against the unknown, just rocking gently on the familiar tide. A lantern sways at each masthead, its light soft against the dark. On shore, the monastery of La Rábida sits a pale outline against its hill. Above it all, the sky opens wide, filled with the same stars those sailors watched 5 centuries ago, unchanged. Above you too, those same stars burn on, whether you can see them tonight or not. The ocean between then and now has been crossed and crossed again. For this moment, you're simply resting in its long, slow breath, held between the rise and fall, between departure and return. Let the water grow calm. Let the rigging fall silent. Let the wake smooth out behind the ship until there's only a wide, dark plain, and the soft, steady sound of your own breathing carrying you onward.